All right. Um, this is Mr. Bowling and Coach Harden maintaining 6 feet distance. Hopefully, all of you guys are well as you are handling this unique situation. We have been tasked with trying to keep some sort of education going for the time being. So we were in the midst of the 50s in the Cold War. We're just done with that. We're moving to the 60s. As you can see, the PowerPoint, this is the Kennedy and Johnson years. You can find this PowerPoint in Google Classroom. So I'm just going to talk you through it, and we're going to put it in Google Classroom a handful of questions to answer based upon this little lecture. All right, this picture shows the presidential candidates in the 1960 election, John Kennedy on the left and Richard Nixon on the right. And the reason this picture is important is because for the first time, television impacted a presidential election. This was the first live presidential debate on television, and John Kennedy was a master at television. And really, since that time, if you do not look good on television, it's very hard to get elected. Perhaps President Trump notwithstanding. That's a joke there. Kennedy was good looking, he was charismatic, he was just a natural in front of the camera. And the people that watched the debate on television overwhelmingly felt that he was the best candidate for the election. So that is the importance of television. He looked good, much more than you could see. Nixon on the right is very stiff and sort of looks like a deer in the headlights. Moving on, just a couple background about Kennedy. He was a war hero, as a lot of presidents are, from World War II. Next, for the first time in a long time, there were young children in the White House. That is his son, John Kennedy Jr., playing underneath the Oval Office desk. Now, Kennedy's administration was obviously halted. He was only in office for roughly 1,000 days. And perhaps the best thing he's known for is the space program. There's a reason why in Florida our rockets take off from the Kennedy Space Center. And what we were doing was trying to keep up with the Soviets. As you could see, they were the first ones to put a man into space. Our first American in space was Alan Shepard in 1961. In 1962, John Glenn becomes the first American to orbit the Earth. And there's a picture of the shuttle that he landed back in the ocean in, and he went on to become a longtime senator. And President Kennedy challenged our country to land a man on the moon within the decade. And we accomplished that on Sunday, July 20th, 1969, when Neil Armstrong becomes the first man to ever land on the moon, the fabled one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Unfortunately, President Kennedy's time in office came short, because he traveled to Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. And here you could see the motorcade just before he is shot. And most of you are probably familiar with this area in downtown Dallas known as Dealey Plaza. You can see the triple underpass it's called. And the motorcade came down this direction and turned right in front of this building, which is the Texas School Book Depository. From that window right there, Lee Harvey Oswald was positioned, and he shot President Kennedy about right where those people are. And here's a couple pictures of the shooting. 2 days later, Lee Harvey Oswald himself was being transferred from city to county jail, I believe it was, and he was shot by a nightclub owner with mafia ties named Jack Ruby. So therefore, the conspiracy theories start. This picture was taken aboard Air Force One prior to taking off back to Washington, and that is the Vice President, Lyndon Baines Johnson, the first ever president from Texas, taking the oath of office. I'm not sure if anyone has ever taken the oath of office other than George Washington that wasn't in Washington, D.C. Definitely no one has ever taken the oath of office aboard a plane. And that is President Kennedy's now widow to the right, Jacqueline. And eerily, President Kennedy's body is in a coffin underneath them in the cargo hold of the plane. So it's best to look at, I think, the Kennedy and Johnson administrations as one. Johnson fulfills the last year of Kennedy's administration. In 1964, he runs for re-election against the very conservative Republican Barry Goldwater from Arizona. And the picture you see of the little girl is known as Daisy Girl, and it was a campaign ad that only aired one time on September 7th, 1964, and it was a minute long, and it shows this girl basically getting blown up by a nuclear bomb. And the message was from Johnson was Goldwater wanted to nuke everyone, so don't elect him. It was very controversial seeing this little girl get blown up, so they took it off. President Johnson named his program the Great Society. And he was, ironically, even though he grew up in segregated Texas, he becomes the president that passes civil rights legislation. We will discuss that in more depth later on. He passed affirmative action, which is a term you will need to define. Affirmative action meant, it was meant to give preference to minorities and women in the hiring process. In other words, the way it had always been, white males would get the jobs, would get the college admissions, etc. And now they put quotas on. You had to have so many women, so many minorities to be hired or to be admitted to college. Title IX is also passed, and Title IX gives gender equality. Women must have equal educational opportunities as men. For instance, if you have 100 male athletes at a school, there has to be an equal number of women athletes, and that's still in effect today. The other thing the Great Society did was he started a war on poverty, and you can see some of the programs, all of which are still with us today: Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, school lunches, and Head Start. He reduces poverty by about half. It went from about 25% of Americans living in poverty to around 12%. It never totally ended it, and minorities still continued to struggle. The next part of the PowerPoint is some, actually we took that out. So there you see President Johnson just giving a commencement speech. The last thing for the Kennedy and Johnson years is foreign policy. And we are still in the midst of the Cold War. In fact, going back to JFK's time in office, we come the closest we ever do to a nuclear crisis. And that takes place in Cuba. In 1959, a communist dictator named Fidel Castro had come to power in Cuba, and we set about almost immediately trying to oust him from power. Remember, Cuba is only 90 miles from the coast of Florida. In 1961, we participated in and backed an ill-fated invasion known as the Bay of Pigs, whereby some Cuban exiles were supposed to land right here at the Bay of Pigs, or I believe in Spanish, the Bahia de Cochinas, and we were going to provide air cover. Well, this was a failed attempt from the start, and very quickly these exiles were rounded up, and we never did supply the air cover, and President Kennedy took a real public relations hit for that. Also in 1961, the Berlin Wall is started to be constructed, and that was a wall to separate East and West Berlin and to keep the East Berliners under communist rule from fleeing to the West. The next year is the Cuban Missile Crisis. A American spy plane, U-2 spy plane, flying far overhead Cuba, takes these pictures, as you can see, And it shows that there are nuclear facilities being constructed in Cuba. If those facilities were completed, they would have, the nuclear warheads would have been able to reach about 2/3 of the United States at that time. So President Kennedy needs to decide what to do. Here you see a political cartoon of Kennedy and the Soviet premier Nikita Khrushchev squaring off, both of which sitting on hydrogen bombs. And ironically, in today's world, the course that Kennedy takes is known as a quarantine. And all of his military advisors basically were telling him to attack Cuba, bomb it right away. But he wanted to give another option. He wanted, because he knew if we attacked Cuba right away, we would be at nuclear war. So what he imposes is known as a naval quarantine. And what we do, as you can see, we surround Cuba with naval vessels. And basically it's a blockade. And we tell the Soviets to dismantle those missiles immediately or risk possible nuclear war. For several days in October of 1962, the world anxiously awaits. Here you can see a picture of President Kennedy negotiating over the phone. Here's a couple political cartoons showing Kennedy and Khrushchev attempting to keep the monster of nuclear war in its box. And here President Kennedy is signing the agreement. And what ended up happening, we agreed to remove some missiles we had in Turkey, and in exchange the Soviets removed their missiles from Cuba. So for about 3 days we were not sure if we were going to nuclear war or not. This was undoubtedly Kennedy's greatest moment. And the last thing for Kennedy is perhaps his lasting legacy in foreign policy. He started a program known as the Peace Corps. And this placed young Americans into third world countries. And we taught them things like agricultural techniques and healthcare and nutrition and things like that. And the thought was, if we could help these countries out, it will create friends, and they will be unlikely to turn to communist, and it's not a military option. And the Peace Corps is still active today. They recruit on college campuses. I guess they're not recruiting now because of where we're at.